Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the Soul of the Creator Savage, also known as a 12th. This is the final raid encounter made available by patch 3.4 Soul Surrender. My name is Mistech and I'll be your raid guide. We begin by pulling Alexander Prime in the north, facing away from the raid. The group will be stacked right behind him. Divine Spear is a frontal cleave that will need to be healed through. Immediately after, Punishing Heat will target the tank for high damage. Mitigate and heal through this as necessary. Another Divine Spear, and then 2 players will be targeted for Blazing Scourge. This attack will hit a few times in succession, and affected players will need to separate from the rest of the group to avoid excess damage. While this is happening, a healer will be targeted for Incinerating Heat. All other players will need to stack in to share this damage. Next up, Alex will cast 2 Mega Holies. This is high raid-wide damage and healers need to be ready. The boss will then cast Gravitational Anomaly. This will spawn a number of small circles around the platform and under random players that will quickly grow and detonate, killing anyone inside them at the time. To maximize the area of safe zones, players can stack during this cast and then quickly move into the closest safe zone to avoid death. Immediately after, the boss will cast one of 2 Sacraments. Sacrament is the familiar 4-point column AoE, and Radial Sacrament is a large donut attack that players need to dodge by standing in his hitbox. Quickly determine which of the 2 he's casting and adjust appropriately. Another Divine Spear and Punishing Heat, and the next phase begins. Alexander disappears and 3 waves of adds will spawn. The first wave has 2 groups of adds. The tanks can grab each group and stack them up while the rest of the raid burns them down. The next group of adds will continuously cast almost wholly, dealing high raid damage. After each cast, the adds will receive a stacking magic damage up buff. The goal in this wave is to try to minimize raid damage by killing as many as you can while stacks are low. Incoming raid damage will be pretty intense, so healers beware. The next wave spawns the General's Might and the General's Time. With this wave, tanks and healers can expect high tank damage. The General's Time has a large AoE circle around it that buffs the damage of the Might. As such, they will need to be tanked apart. The Time also deals magic damage and gains magic damage up buffs over time. This can end up doing some pretty nasty damage to the tank, so focus this one down first. The General's Might deals physical damage and also gains a physical damage up buff over time. Destroy it as soon as the time is down. Alexander will then return to cast Divine Judgment. If any adds are still up, you will wipe. Tanks will need to limit break 3 at 3 to 5 seconds left on the timer to survive the blast. Heal through any residual damage and get ready for the next phase. Once Alexander reappears, you'll have a few seconds of free damage while he casts Chronofoil, sprouts wings, and becomes active. Alexander will immediately cast Temporal Stasis. The time freeze mechanic works the same as it does in normal. However, Savage introduces a number of different debuffs and tethers to handle at the same time. Defamation, indicated by this purple circle debuff, targets players with a huge AoE circle that applies a magic vulnerability up debuff. As such, these players will need to be spread far away from others during stasis. Shared Sentence, indicated by this group debuff, targets players with a small AoE circle and applies a magic vulnerability up debuff. This player must also be stacked with another player to satisfy the requirement of the debuff. Because of the resultant magic debuff, this player cannot stack with another Shared Sentence or any Defamation players. 2 tether types are also possible. Restraining Order tethers 2 players together with this blue line. Affected players must be far away from each other during stasis. This attack does not apply a magic debuff, and these players are free to stack with Shared Sentences or Defamations if necessary. House Arrest tethers 2 players together with this green and red line. Affected players need to be as close as possible during stasis. This attack does not apply a magic debuff either, and players are also free to stack with others as necessary. The nature of these debuffs leaves us with 3 basic rules to follow when we look at how to position appropriately during stasis. Number 1, Defamations can never stack. Number 2, Defamation and Shared Sentence can never stack. And number 3, Shared Sentence must always have at least 1 player to stack with, but this player can never be another Shared Sentence player. The first Temporal Stasis will have the following possible debuffs. 3 damage dealers will receive Defamation. The other damage dealer and 1 healer will receive Shared Sentence. The other healer will have no debuff at all, and the 2 tanks will have one of the 2 tether options. The 3 Defamation players will move to the east, south, and west edges of the platform to avoid overlap of their massive AoEs. This leaves the north free for the rest of the players. The 2 Shared Sentence players will need to spread from each other. To share their damage, we'll have the free healer stand with one of them, while one or both of the tanks stack with the other, depending on their tethers. If the tanks have Restraining Order, the second tank will move towards one of the Defamation players and stand with them to satisfy not only the distance requirement of Restraining Order, but also to avoid getting more than 1 Defamation AoE overlap. Near the end of stasis, gravitational anomaly pools will pop up. Players will have to make their way to safe zones as soon as they are freed and then adjust appropriately for the incoming sacrament or radial sacrament. Next up, Mega Holy into a Divine Spear, a Punishing Heat, and another Divine Spear. This leads us into the second temporal stasis. This time, one tank and one healer will receive defamation. 2 damage dealers will have shared sentence. The other tank and healer will be tethered together, and the other 2 damage dealers will be tethered together as well. Remember your rules and handle this in the same way. The 2 defamations will run east and west to the edges. The 2 shared sentences will spread apart in the north of the platform. Depending on the types of tethers each set has, you'll have one pair stacked with one shared sentence, while the other stacks with the other shared sentence. If you have restraining orders, the halves of each pair can run to the east and west defamation players to satisfy all requirements. As soon as players are free, run to gravitational safe zones and then adjust for the incoming sacrament. Here the boss will cast Time Gate. This will spawn 4 adds and 4 time gates. 4 assigned players will follow the appropriate adds into their time gates. The goal here is to destroy each time gate add before Alexander casts Judgment and wipes the raid. You'll notice that each gate has a different type of add. In the northeast and northwest, wings will spawn and 2 damage dealers should enter after each one. They'll need to quickly destroy their respective adds before they are destroyed themselves by the almost holy damage. In the southwest, a general's might enters. We have a tank enter this time gate. This add does a fair amount of damage, and the assigned tank will need to use cooldowns and self-heals to survive while destroying it. In the southeast, the general's time enters and a healer will go through this gate. This add deals heavy damage, and the healer will need to heal through each cast as necessary. As there isn't much time to DPS, the healer will probably have to wait for the other players to come help kill this last add. Once all the adds are destroyed, players will be returned to the platform. On the outside, players will be handling judgment crystals. Players marked with this orange symbol will eventually drop down a crystal. These crystals will activate and explode for proximity-based damage if Alexander is anywhere near them. To handle this for now, players will be dropping crystals on the outer edges of the platform between the red circle patterns on the ground. These are roughly at the intercardinal points. These red patterns are possible future spawns of Alexander's next big mechanic, and you'll want these crystals to be properly positioned to handle it when the time comes. 4 crystals will be dropped before Alexander begins the next part of this phase. Inception will cause Alexander to disappear and eventually reappear somewhere on the outer edge of the platform. As stated earlier, these 8 red circle patterns are the possible spawns, and we use the crystal placements to predict where he'll pop up. Since crystals explode anytime Alexander is near, we'll know where he's coming by noticing which crystal is about to explode. Tetra Shatter deals proximity-based damage, and all players must move away from the crystal as necessary. As soon as Alexander appears, he will immediately cast Sacrament. Since you'll have no time to move, all players will need to be pre-positioned in the safe areas. Using the exploding crystals to predict where he'll spawn, we know where Sacrament blasts will occur. This gives us 2 possible safe areas to run into. As soon as Sacrament is cast, Alexander will begin to cast a Radiant Sacrament, and all players need to be ready to run into his hitbox. Immediately after, Punishing Heat will target the main tank. Another Divine Spear into Gravitational Anomaly. For this Gravitational Anomaly, the raid will want to stack in close and then move together to the closest safe zone, as a healer will be immediately targeted for Incinerating Heat. Once this damage goes out, the next Inception cast will begin. The twist here is that players will have debuffs and tethers to deal with at the same time. This time, there will be 1 defamation, 1 shared sentence, and 3 tether pairs of either variety. Defamation and shared sentence will need to split to opposite safe zones. House Arrest players can follow and stack with the shared sentence player. The hardest part is handling restraining order properly, since one of the pair will need to go to the defamation safe zone while the other goes to the shared sentence safe zone. Communication in this phase is key, and everyone needs to be on the same page here since you only have a few seconds to pre-position. When moving to these safe zones and juggling all of these debuffs and tethers, remember that you need to be appropriately distanced from the exploding crystal to reduce damage. Once all debuff explosions and the sacrament goes out, players need to immediately collapse into the boss's hitbox to avoid a Radiant Sacrament. Another Punishing Heat into a Divine Spear, and 1 more Gravitational Anomaly and Incinerating Heat combo. Remember to stack in after the cleave and rotate together to the safe spot to share Incinerating Heat. At this point, the boss will cast Summon Alexander. An Alexander Fortress joins the fight and adds his own mechanics. Void of Repentance will spawn 2 pools on the platform. These pools will need to be soaked by players or they explode and debuff the raid. Each time a pool is soaked, the affected player will take damage and receive a magic vuln up and healing done down debuff. With each soak, the pool will get smaller and deal more damage. As such, we assign an order of 2 damage dealer pairs and then 2 tanks to soak all 3 pool phases. Incinerating Heat will happen during these pool soaks. The 2 healers will stack with the first 2 damage dealers who soak their pools. By this time, their magic vulnerability debuffs have fallen and they are the only players available to soak Incinerating Heat. Immediately after, Alexander Fortress will cause Alexander to cast Holy Bleed. This is a high raid damage blast that needs to be shielded and healed through. Next up is Holy Scourge. This will target the primary tank with prey and slam them with 4 hits in a row. Immediately after, Chastening Heat will cast. This is a tank buster that places a physical vulnerability up debuff on the affected tank. The second tank will need to provoke during this cast. Use cooldowns as necessary. The next Void of Repentance pools will spawn at a 90-degree angle to the original pools. Players will now have to deal with Communion from Alexander Fortress at the same time. Communion will drop 6 small puddles in a row under affected players. Players will have to soak their Repentance pools while dropping Communion puddles in a controlled manner. Standing in a place Communion puddle will kill you. This seems easy enough until you realize the boss is also casting Sacrament. There are a few ways to deal with, but they all essentially involve pulling away or turning Alexander to force the Repentance pools to be in the Sacrament safe zones, allowing the soak players enough room to drop their Communion puddles while handling their pools. Essentially, Communion players will split to their appropriate pool sides and begin dropping Communion puddles in Sacrament to maximize available room. The first soakers will soak and then make their way towards the healers for Incinerating Heat. Incinerating Heat doesn't explode until after the last Communion puddle drops, so no need to rush and drop these all over the place. The second soakers are dropping puddles around the pool until it's time for them to soak. Once they soak, they can drop the rest of their puddles in a safe zone. The tanks will need to be careful not to walk through any puddles on their way to soak their phase of the pool. Once all the pools and puddles are resolved, the boss will cast Holy Bleed again, and the healers need to ensure everyone is topped off going into this. Mega Holy occurs immediately after, followed by the tank buster combos of Holy Scourge and Chastening Heat. Another tank swap, and the next set of pools will spawn. This phase will repeat until the boss is down or he enrages. The last phase is all about control and carefully placing puddles while soaking pools. There is a lot of stuff happening all at once, but with practice you'll be able to break down each player's movement. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. For more detailed insight into the fight, feel free to visit the text version of this guide linked in the description below. All graphics shown in this video are also included and explained in more detail there. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.